I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you news from across Ukraine, and we're live on the ground in Washington D.C. for NATO's historic summit in the American capital.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 10th of July, 2 years and 142 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined in the studio in London by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls and assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley. Calling in from a humid Washington D.C. is our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Yeah, well, hi, David, and hi, team. So let's start off my bit inside Ukraine. Russian drones attacked an energy facility in the Rivne region. That comes from national grid operator Ukrenergo this morning. So this is about 250 k's west of Kyiv. I mean, right over in the west, only 150 k's-ish northeast of Lviv, so right over in the west of the country. The fire there that was caused is under control, we hear, and no casualties reported. That comes from regional Governor Alexander Koval. And Ukrenergo said that the attack did cause temporary power cuts for consumers in the region. Now, that was part of a wider overnight attack by Russia. They launched 5 missiles and 20 drones across Ukraine. Odessa and the port infrastructure there are one of the main targets. This comes from Ukraine's Air Force. They say they shot down 14 of 20 drones launched in that attack, but the missiles did get through, killing 2 and damaging infrastructure. Elsewhere across the country, very little movement on the ground. We haven't spoken about the ground in recent days, really. That's partly because there's not been a huge amount of movement, but also because of other bits and pieces, the strike in Kyiv being the main one. But very little movement. Russia has continued to make small gains in the east, in the Donbass area, but equally Ukraine is continuing to reclaim ground and squeeze Russian forces out of the Vovchansk area, so northeast of Kharkiv, that push over the border of a couple of months ago now that never really did anything. That's slowly being blotted out and shoved back. Elsewhere, US officials have told the New York Times that Russia is unlikely to make significant territorial gains in Ukraine for the rest of this year, and that Putin's troops will struggle against Ukrainian defences, which are now in place and reinforced with Western munitions that are starting to arrive. Michael Kaufman, a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia programme at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, he was also commented in the piece, saying a major Russian breakthrough is unlikely. Eric Yarmela, who's a former US intelligence official, he's quoted as saying that neither Russia nor Ukraine possesses the capabilities to significantly change the battle lines. However, that is within the context and reiterated by experts saying that Ukraine's forces are stretched thin. Now, Mr. Kimmela said it is still, in his words, a highly unstable scenario, and that's why Western leaders also really need to focus on integrating Ukraine into European and transatlantic security structures. Going to be the focus this week of the NATO meeting in Washington. On that, many of those ideas just discussed there were supported by a senior NATO official who said Russia lacks the amount of munitions and troops to mount a major offensive in Ukraine for now. The official was speaking to Reuters ahead of the NATO summit in Washington. The official warned Russia would be able to keep its economy on a war footing for several more years, however. They said recent arson attacks, assassination plots and sabotage across Europe are part of a covert drive by Putin to undermine public support for Ukraine. The official said what they are having to do is order undermanned, inexperienced units to move into areas to achieve unrealistic objectives. I think we've seen that. We saw it first in Salisbury in May 2018 when, GRU 29155 did not manage to kill Sergei Skripal. But the official carried on. To sustain real offensive operations, we think that Russia would have to secure significant ammunition supplies from countries beyond what it is already getting from Iran and North Korea. Now, elsewhere, something to point you to, an interesting bit I saw from defence analyst H. Sutton. He's written a piece for Naval News. So H. Sutton runs the Covert Shores website. Well worth a look at that. But he also writes elsewhere. It's written for Naval News about, he's highlighted using satellite imagery that's on the site there, the first Russian Navy ship that's been seen in Oromchira. That's the naval base in Abkhazia region of Georgia. So H. Sutton says that in this new development, a Russian ship that's normally based in Novorossiysk in Russia has docked in the port of Oromchira in Georgia. This is in the Abkhazia region, which is controlled by Russia. The local Russian-backed administration has claimed in the past that the Russian Navy would be establishing a permanent base at the port, but up to now, it's only really been used as a home for a number of small FSB patrol boats, FSB being the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. So H. Sutton says this is the first significant naval ship that's been observed since that claim that there's going to be a permanent Russian base there. He says it's controversial since the port is in Georgia, which implies bringing Georgia into the war. Russia could attempt to use the port as a refuge from attacks. H. Sutton suggests could even use it as a safe base to launch combat missions. Ukraine's options, he says, are going to be limited, complicated, because it's on Georgian territory despite being controlled by breakaway Abkhazia. But worth a look there on the naval news site. And just a couple more from me, David. The Ukrainian military has launched a new international legion to try and entice fighting-age men living abroad to enlist, particularly those living in Poland and Germany, where the largest number of Ukrainians have sought refuge. It's reckoned an estimated 300,000 Ukrainian men of fighting age are believed to be in Poland. Now, the creation of this new unit was part of a wider security agreement signed by President Zelensky and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk earlier this week. And Ukraine's Defence Minister Rustem Umerov, speaking about it on social media, said, "We call on all Ukrainians in Europe to join the Ukrainian Legion. Your contribution is invaluable in our struggle for freedom and independence." Now, David, just lastly from me, I was in a briefing with Britain's new Defence Secretary, John Healey. He's in Washington for the NATO summit. I dialed in for a chat with him and a few other journalists. I'll just very quickly run through some headlines from what Mr. Healey said. So Britain's Defence Secretary of only, 4 or 5 days now. He said that there's a determination in the new government that Britain will step up its support for Ukraine, alongside their firm idea to make UK democracy's most reliable ally around the world. Sort of big claims. He did say there's an indivisibility between Atlantic security and Indo-Pacific security. I then asked him in questions. I said, well, that's asking quite a lot. And also they've said, and John Healey reiterated that this government's first priority is Europe, and that's going to be at the heart of the strategic defence review. So if Europe and NATO's at the heart, then realistically, can you split to focus on the Atlantic and Indo-Pacific at the same time? He basically said no. So I agree, and I think in diplomatic terms, of course, you can link the two: Atlantic security, Indo-Pacific, what's happening with the rise of China. But I got this very strong impression that militarily, this quote-unquote tilt to the Indo-Pacific under the last Conservative government, the last Conservative government, is not really going to be built on any further than it has been already, which ain't a whole hill of beans anyway. But I got the very strong impression that this government's focus will be on Europe, the Atlantic and Ukraine. Now, he said that you can't do everything everywhere. Technology, diplomacy and the AUKUS arrangement will help around the world, but actually they're going to focus on Europe. He reiterated this government's commitment to increasing defence spending to 2.5%. He did not put a date on that. Keir Starmer's only said it would be in this term, which is a 5-year parliamentary term, which takes us obviously to 2029. The Conservative government of outgoing last week, had promised to go to 2.5% by 2030. So, they're both throwing stones at each other, the political parties, on this defence spending commitment. But really, it's amounting to about the same thing, right? They're both talking about 2.5% in a sort of 5-year timescale. John Healey made the point that prior to, the last time Britain's defence spending was at 2.5% was in 2010 under the last Labour government. He made the point that defence spending only fell during the coalition years and then the Conservative Party years. So, like I say, all throwing stones at each other. The wider debate, I think, is whether or not 2.5% is enough. But it looks like there'll be a glide path published next week, he suggested, to how we're going to get to the 2.5%. A couple more. Keir Starmer in NATO is expected. John Healey says he's going to be expected to reiterate that Britain is determined, or he's determined that Britain will be the leading European nation in NATO and the leading nation on Ukraine. He was asked if the Indo-Pacific is going to be less of a focus for Britain in hard military and defence terms. Will Britain take a leading role in Ukraine? And he said yes. You don't often hear politicians say yes, but he just said yep. So be interesting to see actually what that means and if any of these, if there'll be any little placeholders laid down in NATO. And then just finally, he said the defence review that's about to kick off the detail will be in next week. It'll be announced by the Prime Minister. It's going to be the foundation of a mission-led government, apparently underpinning defence industry and the wider economy. And it sounds like they are going to try. He hinted strongly that it won't take a year. He said it would be less than a year. He hinted strongly it'd be much less than 12 months, but more detail next week. But overall, David, a very strong position on Euro-Atlantic security, I thought. A bit of realism. I think in any other week, if it wasn't quite as busy, we'd all be leading tomorrow on Defence Secretary says Britain's pulling out of Indo-Pacific, which ain't exactly what he said, but that was quite telling, I thought, quite interesting, especially if that translates into Euro-Atlantic security and Britain being the leading European NATO nation on Ukraine. But some of those are speculative, so I better stop there. But it was an interesting introduction to the new Defence Secretary.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Francis Dearnley on the diplomatic and political updates away from NATO. Francis.
Thanks, David. A big week. Joe's going to cover the first speeches from the NATO summit as he's there. But just to set the mood, the Telegraph published a cartoon today which featured all of the major NATO leaders standing together as the looming shadow of Donald Trump could be seen just off stage. A striking image which sums up the perspective here in London. As a senior editor put it to me earlier, few seem to be listening to what Biden is saying, just whether he's able to say it. Now, there were some candid remarks from President Zelensky yesterday on this theme, as he said he doesn't know if Donald Trump will support Ukraine if he's elected US president in November. I don't know him very well, Zelensky said, adding that he had had good meetings with him before the invasion in 2022. I can't tell you what he will do if he will be the president of the United States. I just don't know. Now, I think that's especially interesting because there had been some speculation that Zelensky's team had been in quite extensive contact with Donald Trump, and indeed that may still be the case. But nonetheless, the fact that he's saying this publicly would suggest that the conversations are not highly developed and that he is still very uncertain. I think there is more perhaps for him to benefit from in terms of playing up the mystery, it's true, but nonetheless, I think he's probably being quite candid here because the fact is we know that Donald Trump has not formally appointed a foreign policy team yet, so who would he be able to talk to which would have the actual authority to be able to say what Trump would do if he is elected in November? But there is hope for clarity this morning in the form of the British stance. So the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has now arrived in Washington and has signalled, and I emphasise that word signalled because we don't know yet, that the policy that began under the previous government of allowing Kyiv to use Britain's Storm Shadow missiles to strike targets inside Russia will continue. There was no evidence that was in doubt, but nonetheless it is worthy of note. That has been very, very important, that policy, in terms of pushing Washington and other countries into the idea of it being permissible to give Ukraine permission to attack Russian soil. So it's in continuation. It was of great strategic importance, but I don't think it necessarily has come as a surprise if indeed Britain does continue that, just given the fact that Labour, the new government, have said that they wish to expand, as Dom was just saying, expand what they do for Ukraine and not reduce it. Now, as Dom alluded to a moment ago, a minor row has broken out here, it has to be said, as Starmer has refused to guarantee that he'll meet his flagship commitment on defensive spending within his first term in office, despite the cast iron promise to get there. I think at the end of the day, this is a little bit of a storm in a teacup. He's only just been in office for a few days. And the fact is they've already said that they plan to have a strategic review next week. Experts I've spoken to welcome this, actually, before the spending commitments are made, emphasising that the previous review, one, of course, we've talked about in the past, is now out of date. And really, it needs to be looked at much more carefully before there's that vast expenditure that's made. Now, I would say we should have been having the nature of that conversation much, much earlier. But nonetheless, it is understandable, given the vast expenses involved, not to just immediately give green lights to things, that there needs to be consideration as to what one is giving the green light for. Over the course of this war, there's been a lot of different interpretations as to what is required. And so I can understand, and as I say, experts that I've spoken to whose experience I very much value have said that it is important that we take our time on this. And of course, that is also something that's for the wider West too, and planning to commission some interesting pieces on this over the coming days. So more on that soon. Now, turning to Putin's allies, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is, of course, also at the NATO summit, as we've talked about. He'll be updating delegates on his peace tour to Kyiv, Moscow and Beijing. He is unrepentant, tweeting that the tragic and heinous attack in Kyiv proves that our fears were justified, as it was foreseeable. The brutality of the Russia-Ukraine war has reached a new level. This is precisely why we embarked on a peace mission. The growing intensity of the war is a call for global powers to abandon their war policy and instead create a peace policy to guide Russia and Ukraine into a ceasefire and peace talks. This is the only way to prevent further bloodshed. Let me just read a part of that again. The tragic and heinous attack proves that our fears were justified. The brutality of the Russia-Ukraine war has reached a new level. No condemnation of Russia as an aggressor who was responsible for that brutality. Indeed, it almost reads as if Ukraine too was somehow responsible for that brutality. It doesn't say that, but by implication of the fact that it is not Russia that is criticised here, I think it tells you everything that you need to know. The fact is, all of Putin's allies are singing from the same hymn sheet at the moment about the need for a ceasefire and negotiations. And I think that tells you a lot about who the beneficiary of such a policy would be. Evidently, this is a request by the Kremlin to try and create a more favourable environment for peace talks if Trump were to win the presidency. We heard Indian Prime Minister Modi reading from that script too on his 2-day visit to Moscow that we covered in detail yesterday. One of the rewards for him, we learned today, is that Russia has promised an early release of Indian citizens fighting in the Russian army. Delhi's been seeking the release of those Indians who they say were duped by agents on the promise of non-combat jobs in the army into fighting for Russian forces in the war in Ukraine. At least 4 Indians, as we've reported in the past, have been killed in that fighting. It says a lot about Russia's recruitment program and its nature in terms of recruiting people from abroad, and quite often foreigners in Russia who are, as I say, duped into signing up to things they don't quite realise. But that doesn't seem to have deterred the leader of the world's largest democracy to be making the kind of commitments that he has of late. Now, finally, just a word on the economic front in the context of the NATO summit before we get to Joe there. Bloomberg has published an interesting read revealing that Saudi Arabia has privately hinted earlier this year that it might sell European debt holdings if the G7 decided to seize almost $300 billion worth of Russia's frozen assets. Now, this matters a lot, of course, because we've talked about those frozen assets many times, and this would perhaps tell you a lot about the challenge Western powers have had into trying to do that, and why, in the end, it was only the interest rather than the assets themselves. But what needs to be asked is whether Saudi Arabia really would sell some of its debt holdings if the G7 did this. After all, what else, or where else would they keep their money if not in dollars or euros? The Chinese currency isn't strong enough. Certainly the ruble isn't. So they may well be bluffing, but nonetheless it explains why there perhaps hasn't been more of an assertive policy in that regard. It is interesting. And just lastly, on the similar theme, Bloomberg also published an interesting read about Russian tycoons who are said to have received billions of dollars in dividends as their companies resumed or boosted payouts amid easing economic uncertainty in Russia. At least a dozen business people, they report, gained more than 1 trillion rubles, that's about $11.3 billion in 2023 in the first quarter of this year, according to data on dividends compiled by Bloomberg from publicly disclosed information. As they write, many have close links to Putin and include some who've been sanctioned over the war. Many commodities exporters have resumed payment of dividends after reshaping their businesses and rerouting sales towards markets in China, India, and other global South nations that haven't implemented sanctions over the war in Ukraine. Now, that's not to say, as Bloomberg themselves point out, that Russia's economy may not face significant problems in the second half of this year and beyond. There is an expectation that the government may be obliged to raise taxes and that indeed things may not be completely rosy under the bonnet. But nonetheless, this is obviously a worrying sign from the perspective of the Russian economy being close to a serious crisis, as some were speculating earlier on in the year. Indeed, Chris Weafer, Chief Executive Officer of Macro Advisory Limited, says that it is a case of better to take the money out now rather than risk losing it in taxes next year. So losing it in taxes rather than losing it in some kind of economic implosion. But nonetheless, interesting story. Important that we keep focusing on the economic front. But I imagine that everybody's champing at the bit, waiting to hear from Joe Biden in Washington through our very own Joe Barnes.
Thank you very much, Francis. Joe, tell us, where are you and what have you seen so far in Washington?
Hi, thanks. In a very hot and sweaty Washington, D.C. But what first I will touch on is a briefing sort of late last night from a senior NATO official on the state of the war in Ukraine. And there is a feeling amongst the Western intelligence community that this conflict is going to go long and long beyond 2025 as a very bare minimum. This is what the senior NATO official had to say. We should not underestimate Russia in this regard. They have shown a willingness to endure a staggering number of military casualties, as well as the willingness to inflict significant civilian casualties. We all have to be prepared for Ukraine well beyond 2025. This is certainly something that we understand very well. So let's have a look at Russia on the battlefield. So while Russia is making gains, grinding gains, Russia was said to be lacking the munitions, the manpower to mount a successful major offensive and break through Ukraine's new established defensive lines. Their commanders were said to be struggling with organising complex joint operations, so tactics, and bringing together multiple force elements. I'm sure Dom would call it, combined arms manoeuvre. So how you use artillery cover, missile cover from the air, you use your ground troops, you use infantry, use vehicles, tanks, etc. Russia's still struggling to do that on a significant level that would help it generate a breakthrough. Also said to be lacking the ability and struggling to muster enough artillery and munitions in one area to break through and sustain their attempts. So basically, they can get enough artillery or whatever in one area, but they can never then reinforce that to basically turn their minor gains into a successful breakthrough. This is why Putin is going to the likes of Iran, North Korea, China, basically wherever he can go to find ammunition, basically because he has enough supplies, basically through his own economy, through what he can gather so far, to sustain what Russia is doing, but it can't finish the job. So it's going to be able to continue making these creeping, grinding gains, but never enough on its own to break through the lines as such and to make a march on Kyiv again. There is also a feeling that Putin would have to order another mobilization if he wanted to generate manpower to force a breakthrough. So the senior NATO official was basically saying, look, Russia is currently only recruiting around 30,000 personnel a month. They're seen as poorly trained and poorly equipped. And the Western view is that Russia is basically, by recruiting 30,000 a day, is only able to sustain and absorb its current heavy losses, but not actually make any significant progress. But despite these shortfalls, Russia still maintains an advantage in terms of personnel and equipment, in a quantitative advantage in Ukraine. So with this in mind, the senior NATO official said, look, it's important to keep supplying Ukraine because Ukraine is reliant on Western support for its defense, and only Western support will be able to move the dial, although the official didn't go into and elaborate what Western support would be needed to move the dial. Let's move to late last night, where NATO leaders celebrated the military alliance's 75th anniversary at a dinner. They gathered together where the North Atlantic Treaty, the founding treaty of NATO, was signed 75 years ago in Washington. And they gathered. There's a few speeches that I'll run through. So in his speech, Joe Biden said that Ukraine was receiving 5 extra Patriot air defense systems from the US, from Germany, from the Netherlands, from Italy. He said it was a historic donation. Then I'll quote a little bit from his speech. We know that Putin won't stop at Ukraine, but make no mistake, Ukraine can and will stop Putin, especially with our collective support, and they have our full support. In the coming months, the United States and our partners intend to supply Ukraine with dozens of additional tactical air defense systems. All told, Ukraine will receive hundreds of additional interceptors over the next year. Make no mistake, Russia is failing in this war. Losses are staggering. More than 350,000 Russian troops dead and wounded. Before this war, Putin thought NATO would break. Today, it is stronger than ever. Russia will not prevail. Ukraine will prevail. So ultimately, it's nice rhetoric, but it's not concrete actions. It's stuff that Joe Biden, the president, said before. His speech is very similar to ones I remember watching his speech in Vilnius on the fringes of the NATO summit there last year, and it's sort of very similar. He's given a similar address in Poland and around that eastern flank as well. Then there's a little bit more. So, and then Jens Stoltenberg, the outgoing NATO Secretary General, gave his own speech. In that, he said, look, Ukraine has shown remarkable courage and NATO allies have provided unprecedented support. But let's be honest, not even our support to Ukraine has been a given. It is not straightforward because our support comes with costs and risks. The reality is there are no cost-free options with an aggressive Russia as our neighbour. There are no risk-free options in a war. And remember, the biggest cost and the greatest risk will be if Russia wins in Ukraine. We cannot let that happen. Not only would it embolden President Putin, it would also embolden other authoritarian leaders in Iran, North Korea, and China. They all support Russia's brutal war, and they all want NATO to fail. So I think it's actually interesting words from Jens Stoltenberg there, and it hints towards the language in the final communique that's signed off by the 32 NATO leaders at the end of the summit. So on Thursday afternoon, Washington time, late sort of Thursday in the UK and Europe, is going to contain probably the harshest, most critical language linking China and its essential support for Russia as direct support for Putin's war in Ukraine.
Quickly, could you give us some colour from the event? How did Biden perform? There's obviously been lots of questions over his capability at the moment in the US and in the world media.
Biden himself, though, he seemed fine. But one thing I've seen a number of sort of Joe Biden speeches since he won the presidency, and he's very, very good when it comes to reading off an auto cue. And he's actually a very good performer. I think some of his problems come when he is having to think of things off the top of his head, but that's just a personal sort of feeling. So he was fine. Look, it was a really glamorous event. I wasn't there because media weren't invited, unfortunately, so I had to settle for what was a lovely curry with our colleague Roz in Washington last night. And then, what was interesting was Keir Starmer. He arrived late, so actually John Healey, the new Labour Defence Secretary, was our man at the event, and he was spotted, but mostly every other leader was there. So interesting. Lots of security cordons around Washington, heavy police presence, as you can imagine, because the sort of security is being taken very seriously here. But I'm yet to actually get into the sort of the Summit Media Centre, which I'm going to venture into after I leave you here. But yeah, that's that. Yeah, so let me go on to where I was going to start from. So yeah, Tony and I were discussing potential stories last night, and he's Tony Diver, the US editor. And there's actually a bit of a row brewing between the US and Canada for not hitting NATO's 2% of GDP spending target. So figures released show that 23 of the 32 allies hit that 2%. And I think those are countries not hitting that target are going to come under renewed pressure at this summit. There is talk of that 2% target being a floor, not a ceiling, so that everyone understands that, look, in a more contested, more dangerous world, we need to up defence spending. And that is, ultimately, it's happening in parts, but it's probably happening slowly. Yeah, happening slowly rather than quicker than it should be happening under the current circumstances. So we're going to be looking at sort of Canada, Spain, Portugal, Slovenia, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Croatia as countries who are not hitting that target. And people are going to actually ask questions why you aren't doing it. And then let's move to Ukraine, the latest. We'll move to what is going to happen with Ukraine at the summit. So Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian president, is here in Washington. So it looks like we're going to get more clarity on what Ukraine will be offered in terms of NATO membership. They're not going to be offered an invitation. That is clear. But from what I'm hearing, some of the European allies have managed to keep the word irreversible. So Ukraine's path to NATO membership is irreversible as part of the language being negotiated in the post-summit communique. So the Americans, the Germans were a bit more hesitant on that. They wanted to see other language around like appreciation for Ukraine's reforms, but it's still got to do more before it can join the EU NATO, and the EU anyway, in terms of anti-corruption reforms. But what we have done so far is NATO allies will announce their intention to provide a minimum baseline funding of 40 billion euros within the next year and to provide the sustainable levels of security assistance for Ukraine to prevail. That is from a White House statement. The statement continues, the United States is proud to support the effort. Our contributions to Ukraine for this pledge will come from funds already appropriated by Congress in the National Security Supplemental, which President Biden signed into law in April. So let's give you some context and run back to that. I remember coming on the podcast to speak about Jens Stoltenberg coming up with this idea of a $100 billion package, a multi-annual package of basically NATO allies committing to fund Ukraine to the tune of 100 billion over, say, 5 years. But he basically was rebutted over that number. And then he was rebutted over the fact that this package would be a multi-annual. So basically they're saying that, look, not all NATO governments can actually commit to multi-annual spending packages because they are undergoing, changes, like in France, new governments, like in Britain. They couldn't make that commitment. The Tories couldn't be seen to make that commitment before the general election, etc. So now we might get more clarity on what Britain is going to do in the long term with Keir Starmer having a 5-year term in office. So yeah, interesting things like that. So I think that's going to be interesting. So yeah, I think we're in for an interesting summit, but I'll leave you there.
Thank you very much, Joe. Look forward to hearing your updates when you join us again on Friday. Well, thank you very much, Dom, Francis and Joe from DC. Let's move then to our final thoughts. Francis, would you like to go first?
Thanks, David. It's easy to lose sight, of course, with all of these big stories about the continuing clampdown in Russia. And indeed, perhaps that's part of the reason why these clampdowns are happening now. Russia has just issued an arrest warrant for Navalny, the wife, of course, and, widow of Alexei Navalny, accusing her of being part of an extremist community. So a court has said that it's approved the request of the investigators and decided a preventative measure in the form of detention for 2 months. She is no longer in Russia. The exact location hasn't been made to the public, but she has slammed this warrant in a statement saying Putin is a killer and a war criminal. He belongs in prison. A member of Navalny's former team, his former chief of staff, has said that she's been arrested in absentia for being a member of this extremist community. Quite a recognition of her determination to continue Alexei's fight. Now, the other story as well is that a court yesterday convicted a theatre director and playwright of terrorism charges and sentenced them to 6 years each in prison in another example of this unrelenting crackdown on culture as well as political figures. Zhenya Berkovich, a prominent independent theatre director, and playwright Svetlana Petrachuk have already been in jail for over a year awaiting trial, as we've reported. The play they did, Finest, The Brave Falcon, was said, according to the Russian authorities, of justifying terrorism, which of course is a criminal offence in Russia. That's something that's repeatedly been rejected by the two ladies who have rejected all of the accusations against them. In one hearing, Berkovich told the court that she'd staged the play in order to prevent terrorism, saying that she wrote it in order to prevent events like those depicted in the play. Now, these kind of stories, as I say, are easy to lose sight of, but nonetheless, when connected together, show that continual pattern of suppression and clampdown in modern Russia, which I think we should expect only to expand the longer that the war goes on.
Thank you very much, Francis Dearnley. Dom Nicholls.
Yeah, hi, David. So I noticed that in the last couple of hours, Britain's new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has put out a note on Twitter that links to, we were talking yesterday about Vladimir Kara-Murza, the dual British national held in Russia. So David Lammy has said, as Foreign Secretary, I'm committed to calling for Russia to immediately release British national Vladimir Kara-Murza on humanitarian grounds. Vladimir is being held in deplorable conditions in prison for having the courage to tell the truth about the war in Ukraine. His absurd 25-year sentence shows the Kremlin's deep fear that more Russians will know the reality of Putin's illegal war and is further evidence of the targeted repression of the opposition. I'm extremely concerned that Vladimir's lawyers are being denied access to him in prison hospital and that the Russian authorities continue to refuse him consular assistance from the British embassy. I was particularly moved when I met his wife, Yevgenia Kara-Murza, and mother, Elena Gordon, previously. Their determination and tireless campaigning are inspiring, and I look forward to meeting them again soon. I thought it was quite strong from the Foreign Secretary there. We do need to keep the focus on Vladimir Kara-Murza, and there are other British and dual British nationals around the world held for their beliefs, which we need to focus on. Jimmy Lai, but yeah, after yesterday's note, I thought it was worth updating that because it looks as if there is now a bit of a diplomatic push on this front, particularly as the reports are that Mr. Kara-Murza has been moved to a prison hospital, or moved prisons last week without his wife being told initially, and now moved to a prison hospital and denied access from his lawyer. So we'll keep our eyes on that one.
Thank you very much, Francis and Dom. Joe Barnes in Washington, your final thought, please.
So I think when we come to these NATO summits or even the more sort of general NATO meetings where they're sort of ministerial level rather than leadership level, the key word that everyone stresses and seeks to stress is unity. That the alliance has never been so united is something we often hear from sort of diplomats, officials and politicians. And I actually generally think that is probably coming under question a little bit, given the fact that you have like the spectre of Donald Trump potentially winning the presidency in America. You have the election results in France. You have questions over whether, or Labour saying it's completely committed to NATO. Is it going to actually increase defence spending? There's been stories in Germany about whether it's promised big investment in defence spending is going to actually differences between the Chancellor and the Defence Minister there. So there's real sort of challenges to NATO, and they're going to have to be overcome. And I think Ukraine is something that is divisive. Sort of you have like from the extremes of the Hungarians who basically oppose membership, they oppose supporting Ukraine with weapons, to the Americans who are opposing membership at the moment and being a bit more cautious on that because of escalation, but they obviously supply a lot of weapons. So I think it's we're going to have to be looking out for some key sort of tells throughout the summit that whether NATO is in fact as united as it says on paper. And my gut feeling at the moment is no, it probably isn't. But it won't deter them from putting that on paper. And sort of Joe Biden, when he gives his final press conference on Thursday afternoon, saying that we are more united than ever and we are as strong as ever. But yeah, we've got to look and challenge the underlying sort of assertions that maybe suggest it. And that's what we'll be doing for the next few days. And I'll leave you there.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.